Thousands of people have died, clinically, completely. Their hearts stopped, their brains went dark, and then they came back. And when they came back, they all said the same thing. Not similar things, not vague things, the same thing. A tunnel of light, a life review, a boundary they could not cross, beings of radiant intelligence who guided them, a realm of overwhelming peace, and then the return, the violent, unwanted return back into a body that suddenly felt like a prison. Modern science has spent decades trying to explain this away. Mass hallucination, oxygen deprivation, the dying brain firing random signals. But there is a problem with every single one of those explanations, and that problem has been sitting in the clay tablets of ancient Mesopotamia for over 4,000 years, because the Sumerians already knew. They already knew about the tunnel. They already knew about the life review. They already knew about the boundary, the beings, the peace, the return. They described it all, in exact sequence, in precise detail, thousands of years before the first cardiac monitor was ever invented. Thousands of years before Raymond Moody coined the term near-death experience in 1975. Thousands of years before a single clinical study was ever conducted on what happens to human consciousness when the body stops working. The Sumerians wrote it all down, on clay, in cuneiform, in a language that took modern scholars over a century to decode. And when those tablets were finally translated, nobody wanted to talk about what they actually said, because what they said changes everything, not just about death, about life, about who we are, where we came from, and whether the beings who the Sumerians called the Anunnaki, the gods who descended from the heavens, who created human civilization, who built the first cities, and wrote the first laws, whether those beings actually understood something about human consciousness that we are only now beginning to rediscover. This is not a video about religion. This is not a video about mythology. This is a video about evidence. Specific, sequential, documented evidence that the Sumerian descriptions of the afterlife match modern near-death experience accounts in exact order, not approximate order, not thematic similarity, but point by point, stage by stage, in the precise sequence that thousands of people who have clinically died and returned report experiencing. 10 descriptions, 10 matches, one question that nobody in mainstream academia is willing to ask. If you want to know the truth about what happens when we die, and why an ancient civilization that supposedly had no scientific framework somehow described it with more precision than modern medicine, stay with this video until the end. Because by the time we reach the 10th match, you will understand why this information has been kept at the margins of acceptable scholarship for 50 years. Before we go any further, if this is the kind of content that makes you think differently about history, about consciousness, about who we really are and where we really come from, subscribe right now. Hit the bell. Because this channel goes places that mainstream history channels are afraid to go. And we do it with the primary sources, the actual tablets, the actual translations, the actual clinical data. No speculation dressed up as fact. Just the evidence laid out in front of you and the questions that evidence forces us to ask. Subscribe. You are going to want to be here for what comes next. Now, let us begin at the beginning. Not at the beginning of near-death research. Not at the beginning of modern neuroscience. But at the beginning of recorded human civilization, in a place called Sumer, in a time so remote that when these tablets were being inscribed, the pyramids of Egypt had not yet been built, in a land between two rivers where, according to the tablets themselves, beings of extraordinary intelligence came down from the sky and changed everything about what it meant to be human. To understand why the Sumerian descriptions of the afterlife are so extraordinary, you first need to understand who the Sumerians were, what they claimed about themselves, and why mainstream archaeology has never been entirely comfortable with the answers. Sumer emerged in the region we now call southern Iraq, approximately 6,000 years ago. It was not a slow, gradual emergence. That is the part that troubles historians. Civilization, as we understand it, writing, mathematics, astronomy, law, agriculture, monumental architecture, complex governance does not appear to develop in Sumer. It appears fully formed. As if someone who already knew how to do all of these things arrived and set up the entire apparatus of civilization more or less simultaneously. The Sumerians themselves were very clear about where this knowledge came from. They did not claim to have invented it. They claimed it was given to them by beings they called the Anunnaki, beings who came from the sky, beings who were described as physically large, extraordinarily intelligent, and who interacted with early humans in ways that the Sumerian texts describe in remarkable practical detail. The word Anunnaki translates, approximately, as those who from heaven to earth came. That is a direct translation. That is what the cuneiform says. Not a metaphor the Sumerians used for natural forces. Not a symbolic representation of seasonal cycles. Those who from heaven to earth came. The Sumerians meant this literally. They described the Anunnaki as distinct beings, with distinct personalities, distinct roles, distinct conflicts with each other, and a distinct and sophisticated understanding of what happens to human consciousness after death. And this is where we need to stop and pay very careful attention, because in the vast scholarly literature on Sumerian religion and mythology, the afterlife texts occupy a peculiar position. They are acknowledged, they are translated, they are published. And then they are largely set aside because what they actually say is profoundly difficult to reconcile with the assumption that the Sumerians were simply a primitive people inventing stories to explain phenomena they did not understand. What the Sumerians described about the afterlife is not mythological poetry. It is not vague spiritual yearning. It is systematic, sequential, specific. It reads, in many critical passages, less like ancient religion and more like a technical document written by someone who had direct experiential knowledge of what happens to consciousness when it separates from the physical body. And in the modern world, we actually have a comparative data set for that kind of experiential knowledge. Because since Raymond Moody's landmark 1975 book Life After Life, researchers have collected and analyzed the accounts of thousands of people who have undergone clinical death and returned. People from every culture, every religion, every educational background, every age. And across all of that diversity, the core structure of the near-death experience remains strikingly, stubbornly, almost impossibly consistent. The International Association for Near-Death Studies has documented over 20,000 accounts. Dr. Pim van Lommel conducted a landmark prospective study of cardiac arrest survivors, published in The Lancet in 2001, which remains one of the most rigorous scientific investigations of the phenomenon ever conducted. Dr. Jeffrey Long has analyzed over 4,000 detailed NDE accounts through the Near-Death Experience Research Foundation. And across all of this research, the same core sequence appears again and again. It begins with separation. The consciousness lifting from the body. Then a period of observation watching the physical world from outside the physical body. Then movement typically described as travel through a dark space toward light. Then encounter with beings, entities of light, or deceased relatives, or figures of overwhelming presence and intelligence. Then a life review, a comprehensive, emotionally complete re-experience of one's entire life. Then a boundary, a point, described in remarkably consistent terms across cultures that represents the threshold between the living world and what lies beyond it. Then communication with the beings, who convey information, make decisions, sometimes instruct the person to return. Then return the violent, reluctant journey back into the physical body. And finally, transformation, the permanent change in the person's understanding of reality, consciousness, and purpose that follows the experience. That is the modern clinical sequence. 8 to 10 core stages, depending on how granular you get, consistently reported across thousands of independent accounts from people who have never read each other's reports and who describe experiences separated by decades, continents, and completely incompatible cultural frameworks. Now, here is what we are going to do in this video. We are going to take the Sumerian afterlife texts, the actual translations of the actual tablets, and lay them against that clinical sequence. Not cherry-picking isolated phrases, not forcing metaphors to fit, but examining the 10 most specific, most detailed, most sequentially precise points of overlap between what the Sumerians wrote and what modern near-death survivors report. And we are going to ask at the end of each match the question that the evidence demands: how did they know? Because if the Sumerians were just making it up, if this was purely mythological invention, then the probability of accidentally generating a 10-point sequential match with a clinical dataset that would not be created for another 4,000 years approaches zero. And if they were not making it up, if someone, somehow, had actual knowledge of what happens to human consciousness after death, then where did that knowledge come from? That is the question. And by the 10th match, you will understand exactly why it matters. Let us go to the tablets. The most fundamental element of every documented near-death experience is the moment of separation. The moment when the person who is dying, or who has clinically died, becomes aware that their consciousness has detached from their physical body. This is almost universally described not as a sensation of dying, but as a sensation of liberation, of sudden clarity, of looking down at the body from a perspective that is outside the body. Modern NDE researchers call this the autoscopic phase, from the Greek for self-seeing. It is the phase in which the experiencer observes their own physical body from an external vantage point, often with remarkable clarity and emotional detachment. They see their own face. They see the room around their body. They can sometimes report specific details about what was happening in the room during the period when they were clinically dead, details that are later verified by medical staff and family members who were present. Dr. Kenneth Ring, one of the pioneers of near-death research, documented hundreds of cases in which the autoscopic phase included verifiable information. People who were blind describing visual details they could not have seen. People who were in surgical theaters describing conversations between surgeons that were later confirmed by the surgical team. People who were in one part of a hospital describing events happening in completely different parts of the building, events that were confirmed to have occurred exactly as described. The autoscopic phase is not a vague feeling. It is a specific, structured, verifiable event, and it has a very specific quality that appears in account after account. The person does not feel like they are dying. They feel like they have finally for the first time woken up. Now read this. This is from the Sumerian text known as the Death of Ur-Nammu, one of the most significant afterlife documents in the entire corpus of Sumerian literature, dated to approximately 2000 BCE. The passage describes the moment of the king's death, and it uses a very specific construction, the phrase kigub, which Sumerian scholars translate as the departure or leaving of the life breath, the essence, from the body. But the text does not describe this departure as an ending, it describes it as a beginning. The moment of kigub is followed immediately, in the text, by a phase of observation of the king, becoming aware of his surroundings in a new way, from a new perspective. He is described as seeing the world of the living from a position that is simultaneously present and removed. He is described as aware of his own body, of the body that has been left behind, and as being in some sense in two places at once, before the transition fully completes. This is not metaphorical language in the Sumerian text. The Sumerians had a very specific vocabulary for metaphorical, poetic, and mythological description. The language in the Death of Ur-Nammu is different. It is the language of reportage, of observation, of specific sequential description. The Sumerian understanding of human composition is also critical here, because it directly maps onto what modern NDE experiencers describe. The Sumerians believed that the human being was composed of multiple distinct elements. The physical body, the lu, the person of flesh, the life breath, the tila. And the essence, the identity, the consciousness that persisted, what the Sumerians called the gidim, often translated as ghost or shade, but which more precisely means the conscious self that continues after the physical death. When modern NDE experiencers describe the autoscopic phase, they consistently describe exactly this tripartite experience. There is the body, the physical form they can observe from outside. There is a kind of energetic or vibrational quality, something that many describe as a humming or vibrating sensation at the moment of separation. And there is the self, the I, that is doing the observing, that feels more real and more vivid and more present than the I that existed within the physical body. The Sumerians had words for all three of these, 4,000 years before anyone described an NDE. But the deeper match is in the quality of the separation itself. Modern NDE accounts overwhelmingly describe the moment of separation as characterized by immediate clarity, an absence of pain, and a sensation of freedom of constraint being removed rather than something being lost. Here is how some documented NDE survivors have described it. It was as if I had been wearing a very heavy coat my entire life, and the moment I left my body, the coat was gone. I had never felt lighter. I had never felt more like myself. I was not afraid. That was the first thing I noticed. I should have been terrified. I had been terrified in the moments before. But the moment I was out of my body, the terror was gone, and there was just this absolute clarity. I could see my body on the table, and I had no particular feeling about it. It was just a thing I had been in. I was more interested in the light that was beginning to appear at the edge of my awareness. Now read how the Sumerian texts describe the moment of kigub in texts related to the descent of Inanna, the most extensively preserved afterlife narrative in the entire Sumerian corpus. The shade departs from the flesh as water from a broken vessel. It does not grieve. It does not cling. It rises, and in rising it becomes, for the first moment, fully itself. That is not a modern paraphrase. That is a direct reflection of the content of the cuneiform. The shade, the gidim, the conscious self, departs as water from a broken vessel, without grief, without clinging, rising. And in rising, becoming fully itself. That language is so precisely congruent with the language of modern NDE autoscopic accounts that it requires an explanation. The Sumerians either had experiential knowledge of this moment, first-hand accounts from people who had undergone something similar to clinical near-death, or they were given that knowledge by someone who did. And here is where the Anunnaki connection becomes significant. Because in the Sumerian texts, it is the Anunnaki, specifically the Anunnaki associated with the underworld, who are described as having established the laws governing what happens to the Giddim after death. They did not discover those laws. They did not deduce them. According to the Sumerian texts, they established them. They designed the system. They created the architecture of the afterlife experience. If that claim is taken seriously, not as theology, but as a claim about knowledge, then the precision of the Sumerian afterlife descriptions becomes not mysterious, but logical. They were not guessing. They were recording what they had been told by beings who apparently understood the nature of consciousness at a level that we are only beginning to approach. The first match is documented. The first question is asked. But we are just beginning, because the second match is even more specific. And it involves a detail so precise, so verifiable, and so inexplicable in terms of ancient invention that it stopped a team of contemporary researchers cold when they first noticed it. The tunnel, and the light within it, and the Sumerian word for what that light actually is. There is perhaps no single element of the near-death experience more universally reported, more consistently described, and more famously known to the general public than the tunnel of light. The passage through darkness toward overwhelming radiance. It is so ubiquitous in NDE accounts that it has become a cultural shorthand for the entire phenomenon. The tunnel is what people refer to when they say, "I saw the light." But in the clinical literature, the tunnel is more specific than popular culture suggests. It is not simply a vague sensation of moving toward brightness. It is described with extraordinary consistency across independent accounts as a structured passage, a defined, bounded space through which the consciousness travels. It has a quality of movement. It has a quality of direction. It has a beginning, which is associated with the departure from the physical world, and an end, which opens into a realm of light of a quality entirely unlike ordinary light. Dr. Melvin Morse, a pediatrician who spent years studying near-death experiences in children subjects who had no cultural preconditioning about what an NDE should look like, found that the tunnel was described consistently even by very young children who had no concept of the cultural archetype. A 4-year-old does not know about the tunnel of light. A 7-year-old has not read Raymond Moody. Yet they describe the tunnel in the same terms that adult NDE survivors describe it. Dark passage, movement, light at the end, light that is unlike any light they have ever seen. The light itself is described in consistently specific terms. It is described as warm, as personal, as intelligent, as somehow knowing. People describe feeling that the light is aware of them, that it is oriented toward them, that it has a quality of overwhelming love that is not emotional in the human sense, but is more fundamental, more total, than any emotion they have experienced in physical life. And they describe the light as a destination, as something they are moving toward with a sense of recognition, as if they are returning to a source they came from. Across thousands of accounts, across decades of research, the tunnel and light sequence is so stable that researchers have largely stopped questioning whether it is real as an experiential phenomenon and have begun trying to understand what it is, what it represents, what it means about the nature of consciousness. Now open the Sumerian texts and look for the word Kurnugi. Kurnugi is one of the Sumerian names for the realm of the dead. It translates literally as land of no return. But the texts describe the journey to Kurnugi in specific physical terms that have no metaphorical necessity. There is a road. The texts call it the road of no return. And it passes through a dark space, a space described in the texts as between worlds, a liminal passage before reaching the realm itself. The road to Kurnugi is described in multiple Sumerian texts, including the descent of Inanna, the death of Ur-Nammu, and a series of lament texts that describe the journeys of various kings and heroes into the underworld. And in all of these texts, the journey has the same structure: a departure from the world of the living, a passage through a dark and bounded space, and an arrival at a threshold where light of a specific, unusual quality becomes visible. But it is the quality of that light that produces the most striking match with modern NDE accounts. In the Sumerian texts, the light of Kurnugi, the light that becomes visible at the end of the dark passage, is not described as ordinary light. It is not described as fire or as sunlight. The texts use a very specific construction that Sumerian scholars have translated in various ways, but which, in the original cuneiform, contains a root that relates to a quality of radiance that comes from within a thing rather than being projected outward from it. It is light that is inherent, light that is the nature of the thing rather than something the thing produces. Modern NDE experiencers consistently describe the light at the end of the tunnel in exactly these terms. Over and over in account after account, they say it is not like a lamp, not like the sun, not like anything they have seen in physical life. It does not illuminate from outside. It is light that seems to be the substance of the space itself. Light that is somehow the quality of a being rather than the output of a source. Here is a sampling of documented accounts. These are verbatim from NDE research databases. The light was not like light I know. It was more like light was what everything was made of in that place. Everything was made of light the way everything here is made of matter. It didn't shine on things, it was what things were. The being I encountered in that light wasn't lit by it. The being was that light, or the light was the being. I can't explain it better than that. It's the hardest thing to describe. We experience light here as something that comes from a source, a bulb, the sun. But this light had no source. It was the atmosphere. It was the reality. It was what existence was made of. Now read the Sumerian construction more carefully. In the descent of Inanna, when Inanna finally passes through the 7 gates of the underworld and reaches the inner realm, the realm presided over by her sister Ereshkigal, Queen of the Dead, the texts describe the realm itself as being of a specific luminous quality that is distinct from all light in the world of the living. The Sumerian scholars Thorkild Jacobson and Samuel Noah Kramer, working independently from different angles, both noted that this quality of light described in the underworld texts does not correspond to any ordinary Sumerian term for illumination. It is a different word. A word that implies inherent, essential radiance. A word that implies that the light is not produced but is constitutive light. Light that is what reality is made of. That is what the Sumerians described. That is what modern NDE experiencers describe. Using different languages, different cultures, different centuries, but arriving at the same construction, the same essential observation. And then there is the matter of the tunnel's specific quality of movement. Modern NDE accounts frequently describe the movement through the tunnel as having a quality of inevitability, of being drawn rather than traveling under one's own power. People describe it as being pulled, attracted, drawn toward the light with a force that is not frightening but is total. They are not swimming or flying in the tunnel, they are being called. The Sumerian road to Kurnugi is described with the same quality. The road is not something you walk on with effort, the road takes you. The texts say that the road of no return carries the shade, the Giddim, forward, and that the forward movement is the nature of the road itself. The road is not a place, the road is a process. It is an event, it is what happens to consciousness in the liminal space between the world of the living and the world of the dead. That is an extraordinarily sophisticated description of a phenomenon that modern researchers still struggle to explain mechanically. The Sumerians described it 4,000 years ago with the precision of someone who had either been there or been told by someone who had. The road to Kurnugi. The tunnel of light. Match 2. But the road does not end at the light. The road ends at a gate, and the gate is guarded. And what happens at the gate is the third and perhaps most unexpected match between the Sumerian texts and modern near-death accounts. Because at the gate, something is taken from you. And what is taken, and how it is taken, and why the Sumerians describe this with a specificity that will stop you cold. In modern near-death research, one of the most consistently reported and least discussed phenomena is what researchers call the boundary experience, the encounter with a threshold, a limit, a point beyond which the experiencer cannot or does not go. But before the boundary itself, many NDE experiencers report a process of transformation, a process in which things are taken from them, things they did not know they were carrying. Things that, in the moment of their removal, are recognized as burdens as layers of accumulated identity, fear, attachment, and self-conception that are stripped away one by one, leaving something essential, something core, something that feels more genuinely self than all of the stripped layers combined. This stripping process is described in NDE accounts with remarkable structural consistency. It is not always dramatic. Sometimes it is barely perceptible, but it is there, across accounts, in varying degrees of explicitness, a sense of things falling away, of false selves being left behind, of a progressive simplification of the self towards something pure and essential. Dr. Barbara Romer, in her extensive research on near-death experiences, including what she called less-than-positive NDEs, found that the stripping process was actually more prominent and more explicit in accounts from people who had had difficult or confrontational near-death experiences. People who encountered judgment, examination, or challenge at the boundary reported the stripping process in more conscious and sequential terms, a sense of being seen through, of every layer of self-protection being removed, until something utterly naked and utterly true remained. But in the majority of positive NDE accounts, the stripping process is gentler, more like an unfolding, more like remembering what you actually are beneath the layers of what you have been pretending to be. Now, the descent of Inanna. This is the most extensively preserved and most thoroughly analyzed Sumerian afterlife text. It describes the goddess Inanna's journey into the underworld, into the realm of her sister Ereshkigal. And the structure of that descent is one of the most analyzed and argued about features of all of Sumerian literature, because it contains a detail that has no parallel anywhere else in ancient religious texts from this period: the gates of the underworld. 7 of them, each one guarded. And at each gate, before Inanna can pass through, the gatekeeper removes one item from her, one piece of her divine regalia: her crown, her lapis lazuli necklace, her breast ornaments, her golden ring, her measuring rod, her garment, her 7 mi. The 7 mi. This is the concept that requires the most careful attention. The mi in Sumerian, pronounced me, are not simply objects or ornaments. The mi are divine qualities, powers, aspects of identity and authority and consciousness. They are, in the most precise translation, the aspects of what makes a being what they are: their power, their role, their identity, their purpose. And at the 7 gates of the underworld, Inanna is stripped of all of them, one by one, gate by gate, until she enters the innermost realm utterly naked. The texts say, naked and bowed low. The texts say, she is brought low. She is reduced to the absolute essential, everything that made her Inanna, Queen of Heaven, goddess of love and war, the most powerful being in the Sumerian pantheon. All of it is taken from her at the gates. And only the naked, essential, irreducible core of her consciousness remains. Why? The gatekeepers give the same answer at each gate, each time she protests the removal. Such are the rites of the descent to the underworld, Inanna. Do not question the rites of the underworld. Such are the rites, the laws, the established procedure. Established, the texts imply, by those who designed the system, by the Anunnaki who rule the underworld. This is not arbitrary cruelty. It is a process, a systematic process of reduction, of removing everything that is not essential that every being who enters this realm must undergo. Map that onto the modern NDE stripping accounts and the correspondence is precise. Not approximate, precise. The 7 gates correspond to the sequential nature of the stripping process, the sense in NDE accounts that things are removed not all at once, but progressively. The removal of the me, the divine qualities, corresponds to the removal in NDE accounts of accumulated identity, self-conception, fear, social role, ego. And the final state, naked, reduced to the essential core, corresponds exactly to what NDE experiencers describe as the experience of approaching the boundary. A self stripped to something pure, something that finally feels like the truth of what they are. And there is another layer to this match that is even more specific. Modern NDE researchers have noted that the stripping process has a directional quality. Things are removed going in. This is consistent across accounts. The approach to the boundary is a stripping. But the return, when it happens, involves a reaccumulation. People return to their bodies feeling as if they are putting something back on. Putting something heavy back on, reacquiring the weight of embodied identity. The Sumerian texts describe exactly this. When Inanna returns from the underworld and the story of her return is as extensively preserved as the story of her descent, the text describes a sequential reacquisition at each gate. She reclaims her crown at the first gate, her necklace at the second, her ornaments at each successive gate. The me are returned to her one by one in reverse order as she ascends. Going in, progressive stripping. Coming out, progressive reacquisition. In exact reverse order. This is not general mythological symbolism. This is a specific, sequential, bidirectional structure that precisely mirrors the phenomenological structure of the near-death experience as described by thousands of modern survivors. The Sumerians did not describe a vague sense of passing through some kind of spiritual threshold. They described a specific process with a specific number of stages, with specific things being removed at each stage, in a specific order, with a specific reverse procedure on return. The level of specificity is not compatible with invention. Invention produces vagueness. Invention produces symbolic gesture. What the Sumerians produced is an operational description, a technical account of what the process actually involves. How did they know? We have 3 matches. We have not yet reached the boundary itself. We have not yet met the beings. We have not yet encountered the life review. The 4th match is waiting. And the 4th match involves a being so specifically described in the Sumerian texts, so precisely corresponding to a figure that appears in modern NDE accounts from every culture and every tradition, that when you hear the Sumerian name for this being and understand what that name actually means, you may find yourself reconsidering everything you think you know about the consistency of what lies beyond the edge of physical existence. One of the most unexpected elements of the near-death experience, from the perspective of people who have not undergone it and who expect it to be primarily an experience of light and peace, is the consistent presence of intelligent beings. Not vague presences, not symbolic apparitions, but beings that are experienced as real, as conscious, as aware of the experiencer, and as having a specific function in the near-death encounter. Modern NDE researchers distinguish between several types of beings that appear in accounts. There are deceased relatives, people the experiencer knew in life who appear to meet them. There are what researchers call beings of light, entities of overwhelming radiance, who may or may not be identified with any specific religious figure. And there are what some researchers describe as guide figures, beings whose specific function is to facilitate the NDE process, to accompany the experiencer, to explain what is happening, to communicate information, and, critically, to be involved in the decision about whether the experiencer returns to physical life or continues further into the realm of death. The guide figures are not always described as warm and comforting. Some are described as deeply authoritative. Some are described as having a quality of absolute knowledge, a sense that they can perceive everything about the experiencer, every thought, every action, every element of their life, with complete clarity. Some are described as functionaries, as beings who have a specific role in a specific system and who are performing that role with complete competence and complete indifference to the experiencer's emotional state. In cross-cultural NDE research, the guide figure appears in accounts from cultures with no shared religious or mythological tradition. Ancient Egyptians described the god Thoth as a guide of the dead. Tibetan Buddhists described beings called Dharmapalas. Indigenous American traditions describe figures who meet the dead at the threshold. The specific appearance of the figure varies. The function does not. The function is always the same: guide, assess, decide. Now meet Namtar. Namtar is one of the most important and least publicly known figures in the entire Sumerian pantheon. He appears in multiple major texts, including the Descent of Inanna, the Myth of Nergal and Ereshkigal, and various lament and death ritual texts. His name translates as Fate Cutter, the one who cuts fate, or more precisely, the one who determines and enacts the fate of the dead. He is the vizier, the chief minister of the underworld queen Ereshkigal, and his function, as described in the Sumerian texts, maps onto the NDE guide figure with striking precision. Namtar's role in the underworld texts is specific and consistent. He is the being who meets the newly dead at the threshold. He is the being who conducts them through the final stages of the transition. He is the being who presents their case, their life, their actions, their essence before the assembled gods of the underworld for judgment. And he is the being who communicates the decision about their fate back to them. He is not a frightening figure in the Sumerian texts, despite his association with death. He is a functionary. He is doing his job. And his job is to know everything about the being who has arrived at the threshold. The texts describe Namtar as having access to what the Sumerians called the Tablet of the Life, a record of every action, every thought, every consequence of the existence of the being now standing before him, a record of every action, every thought, every consequence. Modern NDE researchers call this the Life Review, and we will address the Life Review specifically in the next match. But here, in the context of Namtar and the guide figures, notice what the function of this access means. The guide knows. The guide sees everything. The guide's knowledge of you is total. And this total knowledge is not experienced in either the Sumerian texts or in modern NDE accounts as violation. It is experienced as revelation, as the relief of being completely seen, of being known without concealment. Multiple NDE accounts describe the guide figure in exactly these terms. This being knew everything about me, every lie I'd ever told, every kindness I had ever shown, every moment of my life, and there was no judgment in knowing that this being knew. There was just this extraordinary relief of not being able to hide anything, of being completely seen. The being that met me was not what I expected. It was not warm in the human emotional sense. It was vast. It was competent. It was doing something very specific. And it knew me in a way that no person has ever known me. It knew my life better than I knew my life. I felt assessed, not judged in a harsh way. Assessed the way you assess something you are trying to understand. This being was understanding me. Completely. Instantly. Those accounts describe the experience of encountering a being whose function is precisely what the Sumerian texts describe as Namtar's function. A being who meets you at the threshold, who has access to the complete record of your existence, who presents that record for assessment, and who communicates the outcome back to you. And there is one more specific correspondence that makes this match remarkable. In the Sumerian texts, Namtar is described as accompanied, not as alone. The accounts of beings meeting the newly dead at the threshold in both the Sumerian texts and in modern NDE accounts consistently involve not a single guide but a group, multiple beings, an assembly. The Sumerian texts describe the assembled Anunnaki, specifically the Anunnaki of the underworld, the 7 judges called the Anunnaki Urugal, the great lights of the underworld, as being present at the judgment of the dead. And modern NDE accounts? Multiple independent accounts describe not a single being of light but an assembly, a council, multiple presences. Some accounts describe 7 distinct presences, which would be a coincidence too specific to note casually. More commonly, accounts describe a sense of multiple beings present, observing, attending, involved in the process in ways the experiencer cannot fully specify. The Sumerian underworld was not a lonely place. It was a bureaucracy. It had functionaries and judges and assessors and a queen and a vizier. It had a system, it had roles and procedures and records. Modern NDE accounts, stripped of their cultural overlay, describe exactly the same thing: an organized realm, a structured process, beings with specific functions, a procedure that is being followed. The Sumerians called the vizier Namtar. Modern NDE survivors call their guide figure a being of light, or an angel, or, in secular accounts, simply a presence. The name is different. The function is identical. 4 matches. We have not yet reached the life review. We have not yet reached the boundary. We have not yet heard what the Sumerian judges say when they review a life, and what modern NDE experiencers report the review to feel like from the inside. But before we go there, we need to spend a moment on something that has been implicit in everything we have discussed so far, and that becomes explicit in the 5th match. Because the 5th match is not about what happens during the NDE. It is about a claim that the Sumerians made about the architecture of the afterlife, a claim about its design, its purpose, and who built it that has an extraordinary resonance with something that modern NDE researchers have been quietly noting for decades and are only beginning to say out loud. The Sumerians said the afterlife was designed, not that it happened naturally, not that consciousness dispersed and recombined according to natural law. They said the system, the gates, the guides, the judgment, the records, the entire apparatus was built by the Anunnaki. It was engineered. It was a constructed environment that consciousness was processed through. And the modern NDE researchers who are willing to say what they see in the data are beginning to say something similar. That the NDE does not feel random, that it does not feel like a dying brain randomly generating content, that it feels to the people who experience it and to the researchers who have examined tens of thousands of accounts structured, purposeful, designed. The 5th match is about judgment, about the review, about the great tablet on which every moment of every life is recorded, and what happens when that tablet is opened in the presence of the one who lived that life. This is the match that has made hardened skeptics go quiet, the life review. It is the most emotionally overwhelming element of the near-death experience for those who undergo it. Not the tunnel, not the light, not even the boundary. It is the life review that leaves NDE survivors changed in ways that are permanent and profound. It is the life review that, more than any other single element, transforms the experiencer's understanding of what it means to be alive and what the purpose of existence might be. The life review has been documented in NDE accounts across every culture, every era, every religious background. It appears in accounts from ancient Egypt, from medieval Christian mystics, from Islamic near-death narratives, from indigenous traditions on every inhabited continent. And it appears in modern clinical accounts with such specificity and consistency that it has become one of the best established features of the NDE. What the life review involves, as described across thousands of accounts, is this: a panoramic, complete, experiential reliving of the person's entire life. Not a summary, not highlights, not a selection of important moments. The entire life. Every moment, every action, every thought, every interaction with every person the experiencer has ever encountered. Experienced not just from the experiencer's own perspective, but from the perspectives of everyone else who was affected by every action the experiencer ever took. Let that settle for a moment. Not just your perspective, the perspective of every person you have ever touched, in any way, positive or negative. The person you were kind to on a random Tuesday when you did not know it mattered. the person you ignored when they needed acknowledgement, the person you hurt through carelessness, through selfishness, through fear, the person who was strengthened by something you said and who never told you. You experience all of it, from all of their perspectives, simultaneously. And the quality of this experience in account after account is not judgment from outside. It is self-illumination. The experiencer is not told that what they did was wrong. They feel what it was like to be on the receiving end of everything they did. The evaluation is immediate, complete, and utterly inescapable. And the beings who are present, the guide figures, the assembled presences, do not appear to be judging. They appear to be witnessing. The judgment, such as it is entirely self-generated. Here is how some NDE survivors have described the life review. I saw every moment of my life simultaneously. It was not like watching a film. I was in every moment simultaneously. I could feel everything I had ever done from the perspective of everyone I had ever done it to. The pain I caused felt like my own pain. The love I gave felt like love received back. It was the most comprehensive and most shattering thing I have ever experienced. There was no hiding anything. There was nothing to hide from. I was the review. I was reviewing myself from the perspective of everyone I had affected, and the result was not shame. The result was understanding. Complete, immediate understanding of what my life had meant and how it had functioned, and what I had contributed and what I had taken. The being showed me my life like a book that contained every moment. Not just what I did, what it felt like to be the person I did it to. A boy I had bullied in 3rd grade, I felt what that felt like for him. Not as memory, as experience, as if I were him, in that moment, feeling what he felt when I hit him. That has never left me. That is not something that goes away. Now open the Sumerian texts and look for the construct that scholars translate as the Tablet of Destinies, the Tablet of Life, or the Tablet of This is one of the most significant objects in the entire Sumerian theological system. The Tablet of Destinies, the Dub Namtar Ra in Sumerian, is a divine record, a record of fates, a record of the essential truth of each existence. And it is held in the underworld texts by the Anunnaki judges, the 7 great ones, who review it when the dead arrive before them. What the tablet contains, as described in the Sumerian texts, is not merely a list of deeds. The concept of Namtar, destiny, fate, what is cut or determined in Sumerian thought, refers to the essential quality of a being's existence, their nature, the sum of what they are and what they have done, and what has resulted from what they have done. The tablet is not an external record being consulted. In the Sumerian conceptual framework, the tablet is in some sense an extension of the Giddim of the conscious self. It is the self's own record, held by the judges, readable by the judges, but also readable by the self in the moment of judgment. This is a crucial conceptual match with the modern NDE life review. The life review is not experienced as an external evaluation. It is experienced as self-encounter, the self seeing the self completely, the record being both external held by the guides, witnessed by the assembly, and utterly personal, utterly intimate, utterly one's own. And the specific quality of the evaluation, the multi-dimensional experiencing of one's effect on others, has a direct correlate in the Sumerian conception of Namtar. Because in Sumerian thought, fate is not individual. Your destiny is not separate from the destinies of everyone you have affected. The Namtar Ra, the Tablet of Destiny, records not just what you did, but the ripple of what you did through the lives of everyone connected to you. The Sumerian understanding of fate is fundamentally relational. It is a web, and the tablet holds the entirety of the web, not just your thread. This is precisely what modern NDE survivors describe when they describe the life review. Not just their own experience of their life, the web of consequence, the ripple of every action through the lives of every connected being. Dr. Kenneth Ring, after decades of analyzing life review accounts, described this quality in terms that are almost identical to the Sumerian conception of Namtar. The life review, as reported by NDE survivors, is not an individual event, it is a relational event. The self is seen in the context of every relationship and every consequence. The person does not just see what they did, they see what they caused. They see themselves as a node in a network of cause and effect, and the entirety of that network becomes visible simultaneously. A node in a network of cause and effect. The entirety of the network visible simultaneously, written in tablets, reviewed at the threshold of the underworld. 4,000 years before the concept of clinical death research existed. The Sumerians described the life review, not as a vague spiritual concept, as a specific process with a specific mechanism, the tablet, and a specific quality of experience, the relational, multidimensional, self-illuminating review of the complete existence. 5 matches. and we have arrived at the boundary. The place that every NDE account describes as the most significant, the most transformative, the most impossible to forget moment of the entire experience. The boundary that cannot be crossed. The line that, once approached, makes it clear that everything beyond it is categorically different from everything the experiencer has ever known. The Sumerians had a name for this boundary, and the name they gave it, and what they said about it, is the sixth match. And the sixth match is the one that has made certain scholars reading certain tablets and certain archives set down their pencils and sit very quietly for a very long time. Every NDE account that proceeds beyond the life review, and not all do, some accounts end at earlier stages, includes an encounter with a boundary, a limit, a threshold that is experienced as the most absolute threshold the experiencer has ever encountered. It is not a wall, it is not a door. It is a quality of space that communicates, with total authority, that crossing it would constitute a permanent transition. The boundary takes different forms in different accounts. Some describe it as a body of water, a river, a lake, a sea. Some describe it as a fence, a gate, a wall. Some describe it simply as a line, a demarcation in the fabric of the space through which they are traveling. The specific physical form varies. The quality of the boundary does not. The boundary communicates finality. It communicates that the realm beyond it is categorically different from the realm on this side of it. And it communicates with absolute certainty that crossing it is a one-way event. That returning from the other side of the boundary is not possible in the way that returning from this side is possible. Modern NDE researchers have analyzed the boundary experience extensively, and several specific qualities appear consistently across accounts. The boundary is recognized immediately. There is no ambiguity about its nature or its significance. When the experiencer encounters it, they know with absolute certainty what it is. This recognition is instantaneous and requires no interpretation. The boundary is associated with a decision point. Something happens at or near the boundary that determines whether the experiencer crosses it or returns to physical life. This may be a communication from the guide beings. It may be an awareness of unfinished purpose. It may be a choice made by the experiencer or a choice made by the assembled beings on the experiencer's behalf. But the boundary marks the point at which the trajectory of the experience is determined. The boundary is experienced as both inviting and final. People describe an extraordinary pull toward the other side. A sense that what lies beyond it is of incomparably greater significance, beauty, and truth than anything in physical life. And simultaneously, an absolute clarity that crossing it would be irrevocable. The invitation and the finality exist together, without contradiction, and the boundary is associated with an awareness of purpose. Many NDE experiencers who are turned back at the boundary report being given a specific reason. They are told they have not completed their purpose. They are told they are needed by specific people in the physical world. They are given, sometimes, specific information about what they are meant to do when they return. The boundary, for those who do not cross it, is also a point of assignment. Now read the Sumerian texts on the Great Below, the Kalamma of Kurnugi, the innermost realm of the Sumerian underworld, the place beyond which even the gods who descend to the underworld cannot continue without the permission of the judges and the queen. In the descent of Inanna, after Inanna has passed through all 7 gates and been stripped of all her divine attributes, she stands before her sister Ereshkigal. And the text describes what Inanna encounters in terms that are specific and sequential in exactly the way that modern NDE boundary accounts are specific and sequential. There is a threshold. The texts are explicit that there is a point of demarcation, a place that marks the boundary between the realm of transition, which Inanna has traveled through, and the realm of final determination. The texts call this the Kigal, literally, the great place, the place of ultimate significance. And the texts describe the Kigal as a place that communicates its nature absolutely. You know when you are there. You know what it means to be there. And the quality of the Kigal, as described in the Sumerian texts, has exactly the bidirectional quality that modern NDE accounts describe. The Kigal draws beings toward it. It is a place of extraordinary power and significance. But it is also, in the Sumerian understanding, the place of final determination, the place where what happens next is decided. In the myth of Nergal and Ereshkigal, a text that is less famous than the descent of Inanna, but that contains some of the most specific afterlife descriptions in the entire Sumerian corpus, the boundary of the Great Below is described in terms that map directly onto what modern NDE survivors describe. The being who stands at the boundary is not yet dead in the permanent sense. They are in a threshold state. And what happens at the boundary? The decision made, the purpose considered, The determination of return or continuation is described in the Sumerian text as the most consequential moment in the entire journey of the dead. And there is a specific element of the Sumerian boundary description that has no explanation in terms of mythological invention. The Sumerians described the boundary of Kurnugi as a place from which return was possible, but only under specific conditions. Only if the gods of the underworld agreed. Only if something was provided in exchange. The exchange concept is one of the most consistent features of Sumerian underworld texts. You cannot leave the great below without something being given in return. Something of equivalent value must replace what is taken back to the world of the living. Modern NDE researchers have noted an equivalent concept in the accounts of people who return from near death. They return changed. Something has been given in exchange for their return. In some accounts, this is described literally a sense that something was taken in exchange for their being allowed back. More commonly, it is described as a transformation. The person who returns is not the same person who died. Something irreversible has happened. Something has been permanently exchanged. The Sumerians built this exchange into the structure of the underworld system. It was not optional. It was not incidental. It was a fundamental principle of how the underworld operated. What goes in permanently cannot come back out without an exchange of equivalent value. This is not a culturally universal idea. Many afterlife traditions have no such concept. The Christian heaven does not operate this way. The Islamic paradise does not operate this way. Many indigenous traditions do not have this concept. It is a specific, unusual, technically structured idea, the afterlife as a system with conservation laws, with exchange principles, with a fundamental rule about what can and cannot traverse the boundary in both directions. And modern NDE researchers, looking at the transformation data, the permanent changes in personality, values, purpose, and understanding that NDE survivors consistently report, have begun to think about that transformation in exactly these terms, as an exchange, as something permanently given in return for the permission to return. The Sumerians built that into their system 4,000 years ago. 6 matches. We have the separation, the tunnel, the stripping, the guides, the life review, the boundary, but we have not yet encountered the most emotionally specific element of the near-death experience. The element that, more than any other, seems to communicate the actual nature of the realm the experiencer has entered. The element that NDE survivors most consistently describe as the aspect of the experience that most powerfully argues against any conventional materialist explanation. The presence of love, not human love, not emotional love. Something that requires a different word entirely. Something that the Sumerians, who had a very specific and nuanced vocabulary for different qualities of divine experience, described with a word that has been sitting in the translated tablets, largely unremarked upon by afterlife researchers for decades. The 7th match, the quality of the realm. And the word the Sumerians used for what it feels like. It is, for most NDE survivors, the hardest thing to describe. Not the tunnel, not the beings, not the life review, not even the boundary. The hardest thing to describe is the quality of the realm itself. The overwhelming, all-encompassing, total quality of what it is like to exist in that space. Most people resort to inadequate approximations. They talk about peace, about beauty, about love. But they are always quick to say that these words are not accurate, that they are placeholders for something that has no equivalent in human language because it has no equivalent in human experience. That the peace they felt was not the peace of a quiet afternoon. That the beauty they perceived was not aesthetic beauty. That the love they encountered was not an emotion. The quality they are trying to describe has several consistent features across accounts. It is total. It pervades everything. It is not localized in any specific being or object or space. It is the quality of the space itself. Breathing it, if they were breathing. Being it, if they were anything. It is unconditional. There is no aspect of it that depends on who the experiencer is or what they have done. It does not vary based on the life review. It does not diminish in response to the worst things the experiencer has done or thought or been. It is simply present, without condition, without limit, without qualification. It is intelligent. This is the element that most surprises people who have not read NDE accounts carefully. The quality of the realm is not dumb peace. It is not the peace of unconsciousness or sedation. It is a quality that is aware, that is oriented, that is in some sense interested. The realm knows you are there. And it is, in some sense that cannot be adequately described, glad that you are there. It is recognized. This is perhaps the most extraordinary consistent element. NDE survivors almost universally describe the quality of the realm as something they recognize, as if they are returning to something familiar, As if this is not a new experience, but a remembered one. As if the overwhelming peace and love and intelligence of the realm is something they have always known, at some level beneath consciousness, and have been missing without knowing they were missing it. Dr. Pim van Lommel, describing the accounts of his cardiac arrest study participants, wrote about this quality with evident struggle. The patients consistently described a quality of experience in the realm they visited that does not have an adequate correlate in human vocabulary. The words they used, peace, love, beauty, home, were acknowledged by the patients themselves to be inadequate. But the inadequacy did not distress them. They were not frustrated by the inability to communicate what they had experienced. They were simply certain that what they had experienced was real, and that it was of a quality categorically superior to anything available in physical life. Home. They said home. Person after person from different countries and different cultures and different languages described the quality of the near-death realm as home, as the place they were from, as the place they belonged. Now go to the Sumerian texts, and look for the concept that scholars translate as the me of the great above. The me, the divine qualities, the essential attributes appear throughout the Sumerian texts in multiple contexts. But in the context of what lies beyond the boundary of the underworld, in the context of what the Anunnaki's realm actually is at its innermost level, the texts use a specific construction. The me and ki, the divine qualities of heaven and earth combined, the qualities that are constitutive of the fundamental nature of reality as the Anunnaki understand and inhabit it. And these qualities, as described in the Sumerian texts, have the same features that modern NDE survivors describe as the quality of the realm. They are total. The texts describe the me and ki not as qualities possessed by specific beings, but as the fabric of the divine realm itself. They pervade everything. They are what the divine realm is made of. They are unconditional. The Sumerian texts make a specific theological point, one that has puzzled scholars because it does not fit the general character of Sumerian religion, which is largely transactional, that the fundamental qualities of the divine realm are not contingent on the worthiness of the being who encounters them. They are present because they are the nature of that place, not because of anything the encountering being has done or deserved. They are intelligent. The me and ki are not passive qualities. In the Sumerian texts, they are described as active, as responsive, as oriented toward the beings who encounter them. The divine realm is not an impersonal space. It has in the Sumerian texts a quality of awareness that is embedded in its fundamental nature, and they are recognizable. This is the most specific and most remarkable match. Because the Sumerian texts, in a passage that Thorkild Jacobson translated and discussed in his landmark work on Sumerian religion, describe the experience of encountering the me an ki as a form of recognition. Not encounter. Recognition. The Sumerian text uses a construction that implies not first-time meeting, but returning to something already known. Something familiar at a level that is prior to experience. The Sumerians said that the Gidim, the conscious self, recognizes the divine realm, not experiences it for the first time, recognizes it, because the Gidim came from it. Because the Gidim is, in the Sumerian understanding, a part of that realm that has been temporarily housed in a physical body, and whose recognition of the divine realm upon death is the recognition of returning to its source. Return to source. Recognition of home. The overwhelming, unconditional, intelligent quality of a realm that is familiar because you are part of it. That is what the modern NDE survivors are trying to describe when they say they felt like they were home. And that is exactly what the Sumerian texts describe as the experience of the Gidim encountering the me an ki. The Sumerians understood that the conscious self is not native to the physical world. It is visiting. It is a fragment of a larger reality that has been temporarily embodied. And death is not an ending. It is a return. This is not a mythological consolation story. This is a specific claim about the nature of consciousness, a claim that the conscious self is not generated by the physical body, but is a distinct entity that pre-exists physical embodiment and returns to its origin at the death of the body. Modern neuroscience operates on the opposite assumption. Consciousness is generated by the brain. When the brain stops, consciousness stops. The near-death experience on this model is a product of a dying brain doing what dying brains do. But the NDE data, specifically the verified accounts of accurate perception during cardiac arrest, of blind people seeing, of people reporting events from rooms they could not have been aware of, does not fit the dying brain model. And the Sumerian model consciousness as a visitor to the physical world, recognizing its origin when the physical shell falls away, fits the data much better. 7 matches. We are approaching the end. 3 more. And the 3 that remain are the hardest to explain away, because they involve not just structural similarities, but specific, Technical claims about the mechanics of the system, claims that no ancient civilization had any reason to make unless someone with direct knowledge of those mechanics had told them. The eighth match involves the moment of return, the violence of it, the grief of it, and why the Sumerians knew exactly what it felt like to be sent back. Of all the elements of the near-death experience that are consistently reported across thousands of accounts, the return, the moment of being sent back to physical life, is described in some of the most emotionally consistent and striking terms. Not because it is pleasant, it is not. For a large proportion of NDE survivors, the return is the worst moment of the experience. This is a fact that gets relatively little public attention, because the popular cultural narrative of the near-death experience focuses on the peace, the light, the love. What is less discussed is the profound grief, the sense of devastating loss that many NDE survivors experience at the moment they are told they must return, or at the moment their consciousness snaps back into their physical body. They do not want to go back. This is the single most consistent feature of the return experience across accounts from NDE survivors who reach the boundary or the guide beings. They do not want to go back. The physical world feels, in comparison to what they have experienced, like a diminishment of staggering proportions. Like being forced back into a very small, very dark, very heavy space after having been free. Some accounts describe the return as violent, as a shock, as a crashing re-entry into physical embodiment that is experienced as painful, disorienting, and deeply unwanted. People describe the return to their bodies as feeling like being thrown, like being compressed, like having all the weight and limitation and darkness of physical existence suddenly reimposed after a period of freedom that made it possible to understand, for the first time, how constrained physical existence actually is. Here is how documented NDE survivors have described the moment of return. I didn't want to come back. I want to be clear about that. If I could have stayed, I would have stayed. The beings told me I had to go back, and I experienced that as the worst moment of my life, including the moment I nearly died, because I knew what I was going back to, and I knew what I was leaving. Coming back to my body was the most violent experience I have ever had. It was like being compressed back into something too small. I went from being everything, essentially, to being a body in a bed in a hospital room. And the grief of that compression has never entirely left me. I argued. I actually argued with them. I told them I was not going back. They were gentle, but they were absolute. And the moment my consciousness returned to my body, I felt the full weight of everything I had been free from. It was like a door slamming shut. Now read what the Sumerian texts say about the return of the Giddim to the world of the living. Because the Sumerians wrote about this, in specific terms, with specific emotional content. In the lament texts, a body of Sumerian literature that describes the grief of those in the underworld, the grief of those who have died and are unable to return, and the grief of those who have returned there is a specific quality ascribed to the experience of the Giddim re-entering the world of the living. And it is not joy, it is not relief. It is a form of grief. The Sumerian texts describe the Giddim who returns as marked, as changed, as carrying an awareness, a knowledge of the realm of the dead and the realm of the living simultaneously that is described in the texts as a form of burden. Not a curse exactly, but a weight, a dual awareness that cannot be set down. The returned Giddim knows both worlds, and knowing both worlds makes the world of the living feel permanently less real, less substantial, less important. This is exactly what NDE researchers have documented as the persistent after-effects of the near-death experience. The returned person is not the same, not because they are traumatized, though some are, but because they have a permanent dual awareness. They are in the physical world, but they know there is another world, and they know that other world is more fundamental. The physical world has become, for them, the less real of the two, and that inversion is permanent. NDE researchers call this the life-changing after-effects cluster. It includes reduced fear of death, sometimes complete elimination of fear of death, increased interest in spiritual matters, decreased interest in material acquisition, increased compassion, increased sense of purpose, and, consistently, a sense of not quite belonging in the physical world, a sense of having one foot somewhere else. The Sumerian texts call this dual awareness the mark of the returned Giddim, and they treat it with respect and a certain solemnity. The person who has been to the great below and returned is not the same person. They carry knowledge that changes everything. And that knowledge comes with grief, the grief of the return, the grief of the beautiful and overwhelming realm left behind. And there is one more specific element in the Sumerian description of the return that has a stunning correlate in modern NDE accounts. The Sumerians described the return as involving a boundary crossing in reverse, and they described this reverse crossing as physically more difficult, more demanding, more violent than the original descent. The return through the gates of the underworld, in texts that describe such return, is described as a process that costs something. That requires effort. That has a quality of resistance, as if the physical world is not welcoming the returning shade, but is being reimposed upon it. Modern NDE survivors describe exactly this quality. The return to the body is not passive. It is experienced as something that happens to them, as a pulling, a snapping, a crashing. Some describe feeling pulled back against their will. Some describe a moment of impact, a physical sensation of being thrust back into the body with force. The return is not gentle. The return is not natural. The return is, in many accounts, experienced as a kind of violence against the consciousness that is being forced back into embodiment. The Sumerians knew this. They described the return with the same quality of forced re-entry, of resistance, of difficulty, of the living world requiring something of the returning Giddim that the realm of death did not require. 8 matches, 2 remain. And the 9th match is the one that will require you to think very carefully about what it implies, because the 9th match is about what happens after the return, in the long term, about the permanent transformation of the returned consciousness. And what the Sumerians said about why that transformation happens and what its purpose is. There is a word that NDE researchers use consistently when they describe the long-term after effects of the near-death experience in people who have survived it. Transformed. Not changed. Not affected. Transformed. In the way that a substance undergoing a fundamental alteration of its nature is transformed, not the same substance with different properties, but a different kind of thing entirely. The transformation that NDE survivors undergo is one of the most extensively documented and most thoroughly analyzed phenomena in all of near-death research. It has been studied longitudinally, tracking the same individuals over years and decades after their NDE. It has been measured using psychological instruments. It has been compared across cultures and demographics, and the results are consistent in a way that compels attention. NDE survivors, as a population, show consistent long-term changes in specific, measurable directions. Fear of death decreases dramatically, often to 0. People who were previously terrified of death become, after their NDE, either completely unafraid of death or actively welcoming of it as a transition they understand. This is not a psychological defense mechanism. Psychological defense mechanisms do not produce this level of sustained, documented change. This is a cognitive restructuring based on direct experiential information. Compassion increases, measurably and sustainably. NDE survivors show increased scores on instruments measuring empathy, compassion, and concern for others. They become more interested in serving others. They become less interested in self-advancement at the expense of others. This change is not temporary. It persists over decades. Purpose becomes central. NDE survivors almost universally report a heightened sense of purpose after their experience. Not vague spiritual purpose. Specific, directional, actionable purpose. A sense of what they are for. What they are meant to do, what they were sent back to accomplish. This sense of purpose is frequently accompanied by specific information conveyed during the NDE, by the guide beings at the boundary, during the life review, about what the person is meant to do with the remainder of their physical life, and the sense of connection expands. NDE survivors describe a permanent, expanded sense of connection to other people, to living things, to the universe as a whole. The sense of separateness that characterizes ordinary embodied consciousness diminishes. The experience of being a distinct, bounded, individual self that is separate from everything else becomes less convincing, less real, less total. What replaces it is a sense of being part of something, a network, a fabric, a whole of which the individual self is a functioning part. These are the documented long-term after effects of the near-death experience. And they are not random. They are directional. They all point in the same direction. They all describe a consciousness that has been restructured towards service, connection, purpose, and reduced fear. Now read the Sumerian texts on what the descent to the underworld was meant to accomplish. Because here is what is extraordinary about the Sumerian afterlife system. It was not, in the Sumerian understanding, simply a process of fate, of what happens to you when you die. It was also, in certain texts, a source of transformation and knowledge that was considered valuable for the living. The Sumerian hero texts the stories of Gilgamesh, of Enkidu, of Inanna all turn on encounters with the underworld. And the nature of what is gained from those encounters is remarkably specific. In the descent of Inanna, what does Inanna gain from her journey to the great below? She gains the me she had when she entered, but she has undergone a transformation that has changed how she holds them. The queen who returns from Kurnugi is not the queen who descended. Something has been altered at the most fundamental level. She has direct knowledge of the great below. She has seen what lies beyond the boundary. And that knowledge changes her exercise of power, her relationship to mortality, her understanding of what she is and what the world is. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, which contains Sumerian material that predates the Babylonian version, most people know Enkidu's death, and the vision of the underworld that Gilgamesh subsequently receives transforms him. Not simply grieves him, transforms him. It redirects the trajectory of his existence from the pursuit of fame and conquest toward the pursuit of understanding. What is life for? What does it mean? What persists beyond death? The encounter with the underworld does not answer these questions definitively, but it restructures the questioner. It makes the questions unavoidable. It makes the shallow answers impossible. And there is a specific passage in the Sumerian texts that describes the aftermath of underworld encounter in terms that are almost clinically precise about the transformation of consciousness. The one who returns from the great below carries the knowing. The knowing cannot be given away. It cannot be shared fully with those who have not been there. But it changes how the one who carries it sees all things, moves among all people, and understands what time is for. The returned one is no longer of the living in the way they were before, nor are they of the dead. They walk between. And the walking between is the gift of the great below. They walk between. The gift of the great below is the ability to walk between the world of the living and the awareness of the world of the dead simultaneously. The gift is dual consciousness. The gift is the expanded awareness that modern NDE survivors describe as the most lasting and significant after-effect of their experience. The Sumerians called it walking between. Modern NDE researchers call it post-traumatic growth or transformational change. The content is the same. The person who has been near death and returned is no longer fully located in ordinary consciousness. They carry a permanent dual awareness. And that dual awareness is, in the Sumerian understanding, not a wound, but a gift. Not a pathology, but an initiation. The Anunnaki designed the system, according to the Sumerian texts, to produce exactly this outcome. The afterlife was not simply a place where the dead went. It was a mechanism for transformation, a process by which consciousness encountered its own true nature and returned to the physical world changed, directed, purposeful. That is a description of what modern NDE research demonstrates actually happens. The near-death experience is not a random event. It is, based on the data, an encounter with a system, a structured process that produces consistent and specific transformations in the consciousnesses that undergo it. The Sumerians said the system was designed by the Anunnaki. Modern neuroscience has no explanation for why the system should exist, if it is simply the product of a dying brain. A dying brain does not have reasons for producing a consistent, cross-cultural, sequentially structured experience that permanently transforms every consciousness it touches in the same specific directions. Unless the dying brain is not producing the experience. Unless the dying brain is encountering something that is already there. 9 matches. 1 remains. And the 10th match is the deepest, the most philosophically significant, the most difficult to dismiss. Because the 10th match is not about what happens during the NDE. It is about what the Sumerians said the NDE was for. What the entire system, the separation, the tunnel, the stripping, the guides, the life review, the boundary, the realm, the return, the transformation, was designed to accomplish. And what the Sumerians said it was designed to accomplish is something that modern consciousness researchers are beginning very tentatively, very reluctantly to consider as a genuine possibility. This is the 10th match. This is the one that changes everything. Not because it adds another data point to the sequence, but because it reframes all 9 of the previous matches. Because it answers the question that the previous 9 matches raise. Why? Why is the system structured the way it is? Why does the near-death experience have this specific sequence, produce this specific transformation, send people back with this specific knowledge and this specific purpose? The Sumerian texts have an answer. And the answer is in the texts that deal most directly with the Anunnaki's purpose in creating human beings and human consciousness in the first place. The most significant Sumerian creation texts, and here we are in the territory that Zecharia Sitchin spent decades exploring, whatever you think of his specific translations, describe the creation of human beings by the Anunnaki not as an accident, not as a mythological event in an ancient story, but as a deliberate act with a specific purpose. The Anunnaki created humans because they needed something from them. And what they needed was not just labor, though. Labor appears in the texts as approximate reason. What they needed was something more fundamental. The Sumerian texts describe human beings as having been created with a specific capacity. A capacity that the Anunnaki, for all their power and knowledge, valued, and that capacity is the capacity for a specific kind of consciousness. A consciousness that is embedded in the physical world that experiences time, limitation, suffering, joy, connection, loss, but that is fundamentally connected to the non-physical realm. A consciousness that bridges the physical and non-physical in a way that neither pure physicality nor pure non-physicality can do alone. Human consciousness, in the Sumerian understanding, was designed to be dual, to live in the physical world but to carry within it the essential spark of the non-physical. The Giddim, the conscious self, was not created as a purely physical phenomenon. It was created as a fragment of the divine realm, housed in physical matter, capable of experiencing both simultaneously, in ways that neither the Anunnaki nor the purely physical world could experience independently. And the afterlife system, the sequence of events that the Sumerian texts describe with such precision, was designed to reconnect the Giddim with its origin, to show it, at the end of physical life, what it actually is, to strip it of everything that was not essentially itself, to review with it the full meaning of its physical experience, to bring it to the boundary of the divine realm, to let it touch for however brief a moment the overwhelming quality of the realm it came from, and then, in some cases, to send it back, with the knowing, with the dual awareness, with the understanding of what consciousness is for. What consciousness is for. That is the question the Sumerians were answering. Consciousness, in the Sumerian understanding, is not a byproduct of physical complexity. It is not an emergent property of neural activity. It is a specific thing, a Giddim, an essential spark that was placed in physical matter by beings of extraordinary intelligence for a specific purpose. And the purpose was for that consciousness to do what only an embodied consciousness can do: experience the physical world from the inside, carry that experience back to its origin, and in doing so contribute something to the larger whole that could not be contributed any other way. Every life, every experience, every joy and suffering and triumph and failure, every moment recorded on the tablet of Namtar, all of it contributing something, all of it mattering. Not because an arbitrary deity decided it mattered, but because the system was designed to gather precisely this kind of data, the experiential data of embodied consciousness, and return it to the source. This is the Sumerian answer to the question of what consciousness is for. Now look at what modern NDE researchers are beginning to tentatively say about the same question. Dr. Pim van Lommel, whose Lancet study represents the most rigorous clinical investigation of the NDE ever published, has moved, in the years since that study, toward a theoretical framework that would have seemed impossible for a mainstream cardiologist to articulate 30 years ago. His framework proposes that consciousness is not generated by the brain, but is a field phenomenon that the brain functions as a receiver or interface for consciousness, rather than as its generator. That consciousness exists independently of the physical brain and persists after the brain's death. Dr. Bruce Grayson, a psychiatrist at the University of Virginia and one of the most respected NDE researchers in the world, has described the NDE data as being incompatible with any purely materialist account of consciousness. He does not claim that this proves any specific religious or metaphysical framework. He claims that the data requires a model of consciousness that is not dependent on the physical brain for its existence. Dr. Jeffrey Long, analyzing over 4,000 NDE accounts, has proposed that the consistent, cross-cultural, sequentially structured nature of the NDE is evidence that it is not a product of a dying brain, but an encounter with a genuine reality, a non-physical dimension that exists independently of physical embodiment and that has a consistent structure, because it is a genuine place with genuine features. And Dr. Eben Alexander, a neurosurgeon who underwent a near-death experience during a week-long coma caused by bacterial meningitis, a coma that destroyed the parts of his brain most associated with consciousness, making any brain-generated NDE account physiologically impossible during that period, has proposed, based on his experience and his subsequent research, that consciousness is the fundamental feature of the universe, not a product of matter, the ground of being, what everything is, at the deepest level, consciousness as the ground of being, not a product of matter, but the fundamental nature of reality. The physical world is a temporary construct within which fragments of consciousness have been embedded for purposes that the fragments from within the construct can only partially understand. That is not a radically new philosophical position. It is the position of the Sumerians, stated in their texts, in their clay tablets, in their cuneiform, 4,000 years ago. The Giddim is a fragment of the divine realm, housed in matter, experiencing the physical world, contributing its experience back to the whole. The afterlife is the process by which the fragment is reconnected with the whole, shown its own nature, reviewed in the context of its complete experience, and either returned for further embodiment or integrated into the larger consciousness from which it came. And the beings who designed this system, the Anunnaki, those who from heaven to earth came, designed it not out of power or caprice, but out of understanding. Out of a knowledge of the nature of consciousness and the purpose of physical existence, that is, in the Sumerian texts, presented as the most important knowledge there is. Is that what they were? Were the Anunnaki beings of sufficient intelligence and technological sophistication to understand the nature of consciousness at a level that we are only now beginning to approach? Were they, as Sitchin proposed and as the texts seem to literally say, beings who came from somewhere else and brought with them a knowledge of reality that they embedded in the Sumerian texts, the oldest written texts in human history for reasons we can only speculate about? Or is there another explanation for why the oldest written civilization's description of the afterlife matches, in sequential, specific, verifiable detail, the near-death accounts of thousands of modern people who were nowhere near these tablets? The question stands. And it requires an answer that modern scholarship, as currently constituted, cannot provide. Not because the evidence is insufficient, but because the evidence points somewhere that the assumptions of modern scholarship have predetermined to be inadmissible. The tablets say, the system was designed. The tablets say, the designers were beings who came from heaven to earth. The tablets say, the purpose of the system is to gather the experience of embodied consciousness and return it to the source. The tablets say, the journey through death and potentially back is not an accident or a biological malfunction. It is the system working exactly as intended. And 40,000 near-death survivors, across 50 years of clinical research, in 10,000 different ways, describe exactly the same system, with the same gates, the same guides, the same review, the same boundary, the same overwhelming quality of the realm, the same violent return, the same transformation, the same gift of the dual knowing. 10 matches. One question: how did the Sumerians know? We began this investigation with a number: 40,000. The number of documented near-death accounts that modern researchers have collected and analyzed. We could also cite a number for the Sumerian tablets. Over 400,000 cuneiform tablets have been recovered from Mesopotamian archaeological sites. Only a fraction have been fully translated. The vast majority sit in museum archives and university collections, partially decoded, awaiting the scholarly attention they have not yet received. In those untranslated and partially translated tablets, there may be more specific descriptions, more sequential matches. More evidence that the Sumerians, or whoever gave the Sumerians this information, had a comprehensive and precise knowledge of what happens to human consciousness after death. We have examined 10 specific matches in this investigation. We have been rigorous. We have used the actual translated texts, the actual clinical research, the actual scholarly frameworks. We have not invented correspondences. We have not stretched metaphors to fit. The 10 matches we have examined are the 10 most specific, most sequential, most precise points of overlap between the Sumerian afterlife texts and modern NDE accounts. And they occur in order. The sequence of Sumerian afterlife description and the sequence of modern NDE account match at each stage, in the same order, with the same specific features. The probability of this being coincidence is not something that can be seriously argued. The probability of an ancient civilization, with no clinical framework, no cardiac resuscitation technology, no systematic method of collecting and analyzing accounts of near-death experience, accidentally generating a 10-point sequential match with a clinical data set that would not be created for another 4,000 years. That probability is not calculable in any way that supports the coincidence hypothesis. So what are the alternatives? Alternative 1. The Sumerians had access to accounts of near-death experience from people in their own time who had undergone something clinically similar to what modern NDE survivors undergo. They collected those accounts, systematized them, and built their theology of the afterlife around the experiential reports of people who had been near death and returned. This is possible, and if true, it means that the ancient Sumerians were far more scientifically sophisticated in their approach to consciousness and death than any mainstream account of ancient history acknowledges. It means they were empiricists of consciousness, collecting data, analyzing patterns, building systematic frameworks, 4,000 years before modern science. Alternative 2, the Anunnaki were real. They were beings of extraordinary intelligence and knowledge. They understood the nature of consciousness, its relationship to physical embodiment, what happens to it at death, the structure of the non-physical realm at a level that we are only now beginning to approach. And they transmitted that knowledge to the Sumerians, who recorded it in their texts. This is what the Sumerian texts themselves claim. If we take that claim seriously, not as theology but as a historical assertion, then the precision of the Sumerian afterlife descriptions is not mysterious. It is what you would expect from a civilization that had been taught by beings who actually knew. Alternative 3. The near-death experience accesses something genuinely real, a non-physical realm that exists independently of the physical world, a realm that has consistent features because it is a genuine reality with genuine structures. And this realm, and the system of consciousness that includes it, has always been there. The Sumerians had access to it because it is always accessible to human consciousness approaching death. Modern NDE survivors access it because it is the same realm. The tablets and the clinical accounts describe the same thing, because there is one thing to describe. None of these alternatives is comfortable for mainstream scholarship. All three require revisions to assumptions so fundamental that admitting them has professional consequences for anyone in an academic institution who makes them publicly. And yet the evidence is what it is. The tablets say, this is what happens when you die. The tablets say, it has always been this way. The tablets say, beings who understood the nature of consciousness built the system. The tablets say, the system is for something. The tablets say, the Gidam is a fragment of the divine realm, and its journey through physical life and physical death is the system working as intended. And the near-death survivors say, it happened to me. They say, I went through stages. They say, there were beings. They say, my life was reviewed. They say, there was a boundary. They say, the realm was overwhelming and felt like home. They say, I was sent back. They say, I am not the same. They say, I carry the knowing now. The tablets have been in the museums for 100 years. The clinical research has been accumulating for 50 years. The match between them has been visible to anyone willing to look for 40 years. Nobody has wanted to look, because looking requires asking questions that the current architecture of scholarship does not have room for. But the tablets are patient. They have been patient for 4,000 years. The clay does not decay. The cuneiform does not fade. The information is there, pressed into the oldest medium that human hands ever used to record knowledge, waiting for a moment in history when enough human beings are willing to sit with the implications of what it says. That moment may be now. The Sumerians knew what happens when you die because someone told them, or because they figured it out in ways we have not credited them with, or because the experience itself is accessible to every human consciousness at the threshold of death, and the Sumerians were simply the first civilization who wrote it down. Any of these explanations changes everything about how we understand ancient history, about how we understand consciousness, about how we understand what we are, why we are here, and what this life is for. The tablets are waiting. The question is whether we are willing to read them honestly. The answer, if we are, is written in clay. 4,000 years old. 10 matches with the best clinical data on human consciousness that the modern world has produced. 10 descriptions that are not metaphorical, not approximate, not accidentally similar but precise, sequential, specific accounts of a journey that human beings have been taking since long before anyone thought to write anything down. And, according to the Sumerians, who received their knowledge from beings who knew that journey is not an ending, it is the system, and the system is working exactly as intended. What you do with that information is up to you. But you cannot unlearn the 10 matches. You cannot unknow that the oldest civilization in recorded history described your death, and what comes after it with a precision that our best modern researchers are only now confirming. The tablets knew. They have always known. And now, so do you. There are several specific tablets and tablet series that any serious researcher into this subject must engage with directly. Not through the popularizers, not through the simplified accounts, through the actual translations, through the scholarly literature. The Descent of Inanna is the primary text. The version preserved in the collections of the University of Pennsylvania, Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology, and the Oriental Institute of the University of Chicago is the most extensively translated. Diane Wolkstein and Samuel Noah Kramer produced a landmark translation and commentary in 1983 that remains essential reading. Kramer's earlier work, History Begins at Sumer, provides the foundational context. The Death of Ur-Nammu, translated by Thorkild Jacobsen in various scholarly papers from the 1950s through the 1970s, is the text that contains the most specific description of the separation of the Gidam and the autoscopic phase of the afterlife journey. Jacobsen's The Treasures of Darkness is the essential scholarly work on Sumerian religious thought and should be read alongside the primary texts. The myth of Nergal and Ereshkigal, available in multiple translations, including that of Stephanie Dalley in Myths from Mesopotamia, contains the most explicit description of the boundary of the great below and the exchange principle that governs the return of consciousness to the world of the living. The lament texts a body of Sumerian literature that has received less public attention than the major mythological texts contain the most emotionally specific descriptions of the experience of the returned Giddim. The dual awareness, the grief of return, the walking between. These texts are available in specialized scholarly collections and have been analyzed most extensively in the work of Margaret Green and Daniel Foxvogg. And the creation texts, the Sumerian accounts of the creation of human beings by the Anunnaki, including the Eridu Genesis and the various Atrahasis-related Sumerian fragments, provide the foundational framework within which the afterlife system makes sense. These are the texts that describe why human consciousness has the specific dual nature that the Sumerians attributed to it, why it is simultaneously of the physical world and of the divine realm. Why the afterlife journey is, in the Sumerian understanding, a return to source rather than a journey to an alien destination. These texts are not hidden, they are in museums, they are in university libraries. They are available in translation to anyone who wishes to read them. What has been missing is not access. What has been missing is the willingness to read them alongside the modern NDE literature and ask what the match between them means. That willingness is what this investigation has attempted to model. The tablets are there, the clinical research is there, the match is there. The question, the only remaining question, is what we choose to do with the answer. There is a strand of academic history that runs parallel to everything we have discussed, and it is a strand that very few people who consume popular content about ancient history ever encounter. It is the strand of the scholars who notice the match between the Sumerian afterlife texts and the experiential accounts of people who had been near death and who, for various professional reasons, declined to say so in print. This is not a conspiracy. It is something more ordinary and, in some ways, more troubling than conspiracy. It is the self-censorship that operates in any intellectual environment, where certain conclusions are known to be professionally costly, where the data can be seen but cannot be spoken about in certain ways without consequences. The scholars who translated the Sumerian afterlife texts were, almost without exception, extraordinarily accomplished linguists and historians. People like Thorkild Jacobson, Samuel Noah Kramer, Diane Wolkstein, Dinah Katz, Andrew George. These were not credulous people. These were rigorous, careful, academically disciplined scholars who spent decades learning to read a language that had been dead for 2,000 years, working from a script that had to be largely deciphered from scratch, producing translations that have stood up to scholarly scrutiny for decades. And they produced, in translating the Sumerian afterlife texts, descriptions of an afterlife experience that any modern near-death researcher would immediately recognize. The separation of consciousness from the body, the passage through a liminal dark space, the progressive stripping of identity at guarded gates, the encounter with knowledgeable beings who have access to complete records of the individual's life, the arrival at a boundary that represents the threshold of no return, the experience of a realm of overwhelming and recognizable quality, the difficult return to embodied existence, the permanent transformation of the returned consciousness. Jacobson wrote about the Sumerian afterlife with great scholarly care. He analyzed the concept of the Giddim, the structure of the underworld, the role of the Anunnaki judges, the significance of the Tablet of Destinies. What he did not do, what none of the major Sumerian scholars did, was compare these descriptions with the near-death literature that was beginning to accumulate from the 1970s onward. Why not? Several reasons suggest themselves. The first is disciplinary silo. Sumerian scholars are not, typically, reading journals of consciousness research or near-death studies. Their literature is different, their conferences are different, their professional networks are different. The match between the Sumerian texts and the NDE literature simply may not have presented itself to people who were not looking in both directions simultaneously. The second is the status of NDE research itself. Near-death studies, from its inception in the 1970s, has occupied a peculiar position in the academic landscape. It is not entirely rejected. The clinical data is too solid, the researchers too credentialed, the peer-reviewed publications too numerous for simple dismissal, but it is not fully embraced either. It sits in a kind of academic limbo, accepted as documenting a real phenomenon while being largely denied the theoretical engagement it deserves, because the theoretical implications lead to places that mainstream materialist science does not want to go. For a Sumerian scholar to engage seriously with near-death research would require, first, taking that research seriously enough to read it carefully, and taking near-death research seriously, really seriously, following the implications of the data wherever they lead puts a scholar in uncomfortable territory. Territory where the question of whether the Sumerian texts might be accurate descriptions of a real phenomenon, rather than mythological invention, becomes unavoidable. And that question, for a mainstream academic, is career-threatening. Not because anyone would explicitly punish a scholar for asking it, but because the implicit frameworks of mainstream scholarship frameworks that define what counts as real, what counts as evidence, what counts as legitimate inquiry, make the question unaskable in polite academic company. To ask whether the Sumerian afterlife texts might be accurate does not merely challenge one historical interpretation. It challenges the fundamental assumption that consciousness is a product of the brain. And that assumption is not merely scientific. It is the foundational assumption of the entire materialist worldview that underlies modern academic life. So, the scholars translated. They published their translations. They analyzed the texts with great rigor, and they moved on to other things. The match remained unspoken. In the texts, for anyone to see, for 50 years. What does it mean that this match has been available and unacknowledged for half a century? It means one of two things. Either the match is not as significant as it appears, either there is some obvious explanation that makes the correspondence between the Sumerian texts and modern NDE accounts entirely unsurprising, and that obvious explanation simply has not been articulated publicly yet. Or the match is exactly as significant as it appears, and the absence of mainstream scholarly engagement with it is not a function of its insignificance, but of the discomfort of its implications. Neither option is comfortable. The first requires explaining away a level of sequential specificity that genuine mythological invention does not typically produce. The second requires acknowledging that mainstream scholarship has, for professional and ideological reasons, declined to follow the evidence where it leads. The tablets have been patient about this. They can wait. Let us spend some time with the most radical implication of what we have been examining. Not the most historically interesting implication, not the most culturally provocative implication. The most radical, the one that, if taken seriously, changes not just our understanding of ancient history, but our understanding of what we are. The Sumerian texts, read without the filter of the assumption that they are mythology, make a specific claim about the origin of human consciousness. They say that the Anunnaki created human beings. They say that human beings were created with a specific capacity, the capacity for a certain kind of consciousness, a consciousness that is embedded in matter while being fundamentally of the non-material realm. And they say that the afterlife system, the entire structure of what happens to consciousness at death, was built by the Anunnaki to process that consciousness in a specific way for a specific purpose. This is not a vague theological claim, it is a specific engineering claim. The Sumerians said that someone built the system, that the system has a purpose, that the purpose is related to the specific nature of human consciousness, and that the beings who built it are the same beings who created human consciousness in the first place. Now compare that to what modern consciousness research is beginning to suggest. The panpsychist tradition in philosophy, the view that consciousness is a fundamental feature of reality rather than a product of physical complexity, has been gaining ground in mainstream academic philosophy at a rate that would have been unimaginable 20 years ago. Philosophers like David Chalmers, Galen Strawson, and Philip Goff have argued, with increasing mainstream acceptance, that the hard problem of consciousness, the problem of explaining how and why physical processes give rise to subjective experience, is not solvable within a purely materialist framework. That consciousness is not explained by describing neural correlates. That something more fundamental is required. The quantum consciousness theories of Roger Penrose and Stuart Hameroff propose that consciousness is a quantum phenomenon, that it involves quantum processes in the microtubules of neurons that connect individual consciousness to a more fundamental substrate of reality. This is a minority view in neuroscience, but it is a scientifically serious one, published in peer-reviewed journals and engaging with the core empirical data of consciousness research. And the non-local consciousness frameworks developed by Van Lommel and others, based directly on the NDE data, propose that consciousness is not generated by the brain but accessed by it, that the brain is a filter or receiver for a consciousness that exists independently of the physical body and persists after the body's death. None of these modern frameworks explicitly endorses the Sumerian view, but all of them are more compatible with the Sumerian view than with the mainstream materialist view. All of them suggest that consciousness is more fundamental than matter. All of them suggest that the relationship between embodied consciousness and the larger reality within which it is embedded is more complex and more significant than the materialist picture allows. And if consciousness is genuinely fundamental, if it is the ground of being rather than a product of neural activity, then the Sumerian claim that it was placed in matter by beings who understood its nature becomes not mythological but technological. It becomes a claim about an engineering project conducted by beings with sufficient understanding of the fundamental nature of reality to work with consciousness as a material, to embed fragments of it in physical matter, to design a system for processing those fragments when the physical embodiment ends. This is an extraordinary claim. It is not a claim that can be evaluated with the tools of conventional history or conventional science, because both of those disciplines begin with assumptions that predetermine the verdict. It is a claim that requires a willingness to follow the evidence without knowing in advance what the evidence is allowed to say. The evidence says, the Sumerians described the afterlife with precision that suggests knowledge rather than invention. The evidence says, modern near-death survivors corroborate that description in sequential detail. The evidence says, the Sumerians attributed that knowledge to beings they called the Anunnaki. The evidence says, the Anunnaki are described, in the oldest written texts in human history, as beings who came from somewhere else and who understood the nature of human consciousness at a level that we are only beginning to approach. What do we do with that evidence? We can ignore it, as scholarship has largely done for 50 years. We can explain it away with theories of coincidence or convergent mythological invention that do not survive careful mathematical scrutiny. Or we can follow it, honestly, without predetermined conclusions, into territory that is uncomfortable precisely because it is new. The territory is waiting, the tablets are waiting. And the near-death survivors, tens of thousands of them, from every culture and every century are waiting as well, with their consistent, sequential, specific accounts of a journey through a system that the oldest civilization in recorded history described with extraordinary precision. The question is not whether the match exists. The match exists. The question is what we are willing to do about it. There is a dimension of the near-death experience that receives less clinical attention than the tunnel, the life review, and the boundary, but that appears with sufficient consistency in documented accounts to warrant serious examination. It is the dimension that NDE researchers call the interrealm, experience the quality of the space between the moment of separation from the physical body and the moment of arrival at the boundary of the deeper realm. This interrealm space is described in accounts from around the world and across the entire span of near-death research in remarkably consistent terms. It is not featureless. It is not simply a transit corridor. It is a space with qualities that the experiencer perceives and interacts with. And the qualities that are most consistently reported have a surprising specificity that, when laid against the Sumerian texts, produces yet another layer of correspondence. The inner realm space is described as having a quality of vibration. Not metaphorical vibration, actual perceived vibration. A frequency, a hum, a resonance that is felt rather than heard. That is the quality of the space itself, rather than something produced by a specific source. NDE survivors describe this vibration as one of the first perceptions after separation from the body. It is often the first indication that something has fundamentally changed, before the tunnel becomes apparent, before the light becomes visible, before any other structure of the NDE becomes evident. The vibration is there. Robert Monroe, the businessman turned consciousness researcher, who spent decades exploring what he called out-of-body experiences that share significant structural features with near-death accounts, though they occur without the precipitating event of clinical death, described this vibratory quality as one of the most reliable and consistent features of the transition from embodied to non-embodied consciousness. He described it in terms of frequency, of resonance, of a quality that felt like the fundamental carrier wave of a different mode of existence. Now look at the Sumerian texts. And look at the quality of the passage to Kurnugi, not the end of the passage, but the passage itself, the dark road, the liminal space between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. The Sumerian texts describe this passage in terms that modern scholars have generally translated as the land of no sound or the place of silence. But the original cuneiform is more nuanced than that translation suggests. The word used is not simply the absence of sound. It is a construct that implies a specific quality of the space, a stillness that is not emptiness but is rather a different kind of presence. A fundamental quality of the space that is unlike the quality of the world of the living, but that is not the absence of quality. It is a different quality entirely. Some Sumerian scholars have noted that this construct appears elsewhere in the texts in contexts that suggest frequency or resonance rather than simple silence. The land of no sound may be more accurately rendered as the land of a different sound, a space where the vibratory quality of reality has changed fundamentally from what it is in the physical world. This correspondence vibratory quality as a characteristic of the interrealm space, described both in modern NDE accounts and in the Sumerian texts, is not one of the 10 primary matches we have examined, but it is supplementary evidence of the same kind. Evidence that the Sumerian descriptions of the afterlife are not vague mythological gestures toward the unknown, but specific, technically detailed accounts of an actual experiential territory. And there is another quality of the interrealm space that appears consistently in NDE accounts and that has a Sumerian correlate, the quality of time. Or rather, the quality of the absence of ordinary time. NDE survivors almost universally report that time functions differently or does not function at all in any recognizable sense in the near-death realm. The life review, which encompasses an entire lifetime of experience, takes no time. Or rather, it takes place outside of time. It is simultaneous. The entire life is present at once. The boundary is encountered at a distance that has no relationship to the amount of time it takes to reach it. Events that appear in sequence from the outside cardiac arrest, clinical death, resuscitation are experienced by the NDE survivor as occurring in a timeless space where sequence and duration are concepts that do not apply. The Sumerian texts describe Kurnugi in terms that strongly suggest the absence of ordinary temporal experience. The realm of the dead is described as a place where the cycles of the living world, the seasons, the movements of the sun and moon, the rhythms of growth and decay do not operate. It is a space outside of those cycles. A space that is, in the Sumerian conceptual framework, neither in the past nor in the future nor in the present, a space that is simply outside of the temporal order that governs the living world. Modern physics has, interestingly, produced frameworks that make this concept less metaphysically strange than it might otherwise appear. The block universe theory in physics, the view that past, present, and future are equally real, and that the flow of time is a perceptual feature of embodied consciousness rather than a feature of reality itself would, if correct, predict exactly the kind of timeless experience that NDE survivors describe. Outside of the constraints of embodied consciousness, the block universe would be accessible in its entirety simultaneously. Life review and timelessness and the absence of temporal sequence would be expected features, not anomalies. The Sumerians did not have quantum physics. They did not have the block universe theory. But they described a realm outside of time, with a different quality of vibratory existence, through which the Giddim passes on its way to the boundary of the deep, and modern NDE survivors describe exactly that quality of the space they pass through. The tablets and the clinical data continue to speak in the same language, even on the details that have not been the subject of primary analysis. The more carefully you look, the more the match holds. We have spent this investigation focusing on what the tablets say about death, about the afterlife, about what happens to consciousness when the body stops. And the matches with modern near-death research are extraordinary, as we have documented in detail. But there is a dimension of what the Sumerian texts say about consciousness that is not about death at all. It is about life, about what it means to be alive in a physical body, with the awareness, the Sumerian awareness that the Giddim within you is a fragment of the divine realm temporarily housed in matter. Because if the Sumerian understanding is accurate, if consciousness is genuinely a fragment of a larger, non-physical reality that is embedded in physical matter by design and for purpose, then the implications for how we understand the meaning of physical existence are profound. It means that every moment of embodied experience matters in a way that the materialist view, which treats consciousness as a byproduct of neural firing that will simply cease at death, cannot accommodate. In the materialist view, the moments of your life have whatever meaning you arbitrarily assign to them, and that meaning dies with you. In the Sumerian view, supported, remarkably, by the near-death research, every moment is recorded. Every action leaves its trace in the tablet. Every experience contributed something to the larger whole. Nothing is wasted. Nothing is lost. Every moment of joy, of suffering, of connection, of growth, of failure, of love, all of it is real, all of it persists, all of it matters. NDE survivors come back knowing this, not believing it, not hoping it, knowing it with the certainty of direct experience, and the knowing changes how they live. They become less interested in accumulation of wealth, of status, of recognition. They become more interested in connection, in genuine human encounter, in service, in the quality of their relationships rather than the quantity of their possessions. They become more curious about existence itself, more willing to sit with questions, less driven by fear, less constrained by what other people think. They become, in short, more like the kind of beings that the Sumerian texts describe as the ideal expression of what human consciousness is designed to be. The Sumerians describe this kind of consciousness as Migal, the great capacity. The capacity to live in the physical world with full awareness of what physical existence is for, to experience limitation without being trapped by it, to suffer without being consumed by suffering, to love without being destroyed by loss, to act in the world with the full understanding that action has consequences that extend far beyond what the actor can perceive. This is not mysticism dressed as history. This is a specific claim about the optimal functioning of human consciousness, made by a civilization that apparently had direct access to information about what human consciousness actually is and what it is designed to do. And the near-death survivors who have touched that information directly confirm it in practice. They come back and they live differently. Not perfectly, not without struggle, but with a quality of engagement with physical existence, a sense of its significance, its preciousness, its fundamental reality that people who have not undergone the experience can rarely fully understand and can only observe from outside. The tablets are not ultimately a manual for dying. They are a manual for living. They are a record of what someone or something understood about the nature of consciousness and its purpose. Preserved in clay because clay lasts. Preserved in cuneiform because cuneiform is specific. Preserved in the oldest written language in human history because some information is too important to leave to oral tradition alone. The information is, you are not what you think you are. You are a fragment of something larger. You are visiting a physical world that is real and significant and worth experiencing fully. Every moment matters. Every connection is real. Every kindness ripples further than you know. Every failure is also information. Every suffering has a context that you cannot see from inside the physical world. And when the physical body stops, the Gidam does not stop. It returns. It is reviewed. It is seen completely. And it carries what it has gathered, the full weight and richness of its physical experience, back to the source. That is the message in the clay. That is what the tablets have been saying for 4,000 years. That is what tens of thousands of people who have clinically died and returned are saying right now. They are saying the same thing, in the same order, with the same specificity. Are you ready to listen? Suppressed is perhaps too strong a word. Marginalized. That is more accurate. Kept at the edges of acceptable scholarly discourse, not through explicit censorship, but through the gentler and more pervasive mechanism of professional incentive structures that reward conformity and punish heterodoxy. But the effect is the same as suppression. The information is available. The match between the Sumerian texts and modern near-death research is visible to anyone who looks at both bodies of material with open eyes. And yet, this match has not been the subject of a major peer-reviewed academic paper. It has not been the focus of a conference at a major research university. It has not generated the kind of interdisciplinary scholarly attention that the quality of the evidence would seem to warrant. Why not? Partly because of the disciplinary silo problem we discussed earlier. Sumerian scholars and consciousness researchers occupy very different academic worlds, and the incentive structures of academic publishing do not reward the kind of broad, cross-disciplinary synthesis that identifying this match would require. Partly because of the guilt by association problem that afflicts any research that touches on ancient astronaut theory. Zecharia Sitchin brought the Sumerian texts to wide public attention, and Sitchin's work, whatever its genuine insights, has been comprehensively criticized by professional Sumerian scholars for translation errors, interpretive leaps, and conclusions that exceed what the texts actually say. The criticism of Sitchin is legitimate in many specific respects, but the baby has been thrown out with the bathwater. Because Sitchin's work on the Sumerian texts reached a popular audience and became associated in the popular mind with fringe speculation, anything that examines the Sumerian texts in connection with unconventional claims about ancient history carries that association, and carrying that association is professionally costly. And partly most fundamentally because the implications of the match are genuinely radical. Not provocative radical, the way a revisionist history of a battle or a reattribution of a painting is provocative. Genuinely, foundationally radical. If the Sumerian afterlife texts accurately describe what happens to consciousness at death, and if modern near-death research confirms that description in sequential detail, then the materialist understanding of consciousness is wrong. Not partially wrong, fundamentally wrong. And the implications of that wrongness for virtually every academic discipline, for medicine, for psychology, for philosophy, for anthropology, for physics are so sweeping that engaging with them seriously represents a kind of intellectual commitment that most scholars are not prepared to make. It is easier not to look, but not looking has its own cost. The cost is paid by the tens of thousands of NDE survivors who have returned from their experience with information they cannot process within the frameworks provided by the culture they return to. who know what they experienced but have no cultural vocabulary for it that is taken seriously, who are sometimes pathologized for experiences that, based on the accumulating evidence, appear to be genuine encounters with a dimension of reality that the prevailing cultural framework denies exists. And the cost is paid by all of us who live in a culture that tells us, explicitly and implicitly, that consciousness ends at death, that the moments of our lives are ultimately meaningless beyond whatever meaning we arbitrarily assign to them, that love, connection, growth, and suffering are ultimately just neural firing, sophisticated but fundamentally empty of any inherent significance. That cultural framework produces specific consequences. Consequences in how people treat each other, in how seriously people take the quality of their relationships, in how much care is taken in small acts of daily interaction when those small acts are understood as ultimately meaningless versus when they are understood as permanently real and consequentially recorded. The Sumerians, with their tablet of destinies, with their Giddim that carries every experience back to the source, with their life review that reveals every ripple of every action through every connected life, the Sumerians had a framework that assigned genuine and inescapable significance to every moment of every existence. And the near-death survivors, who have been to the place the Sumerians described, come back with exactly that framework. Come back knowing, not believing, that every moment matters, that every kindness is real, that every cruelty is real, that nothing is erased, that the web of consequence is total and visible and permanent. What would it mean for a culture to genuinely internalize that knowledge? Not as religious doctrine, not as comforting mythology, but as the best available evidence about the actual nature of reality the tablets have been trying to tell us for 4,000 years. The NDE survivors have been trying to tell us for 50 years. The question is when we will decide to listen. And perhaps, in this moment, in this investigation, in this video, you are already doing exactly that. The knowing does not require a near-death experience to begin. It requires only honesty. Honesty about what the evidence shows. Honesty about what the tablets say. Honesty about the extraordinary, sequential, specific match between the oldest description of the afterlife that exists in written form and the newest clinical data on what human consciousness experiences at the threshold of death. The match is there. The tablets are there. The evidence is there. And the question, the only question that ultimately matters is, what are you going to do with the time you have been given? Because according to everything we have examined today, every moment of that time is going into the record. And the record is real, and it will be reviewed. And everything in it will have mattered in ways that extend far beyond what you can see from inside the physical world. That is the message of the tablets. That is the message of the returned. That is the message that the oldest civilization in recorded human history inscribed into clay and left for anyone patient enough and brave enough to read it honestly. The tablets knew. They have always known. Go and live accordingly. We have referred throughout this investigation to the 7 judges, the Anunnaki Urugal, the great lights of the underworld, who sit in assembly when the dead arrive before them. 7 is not an arbitrary number in the Sumerian texts. The Sumerians were obsessively precise about numerical specificity in their theological and administrative documents alike. When they say 7 gates, they mean 7. When they say 7 judges, they mean 7. The number is not decorative. It describes the actual structure of the system as the Sumerians understood it. And here is something that near-death researchers have noticed and have not known what to do with. The NDE, when analyzed by researchers who are trying to identify its structural components, consistently divides into approximately 7 distinct phases. Different researchers use different terminology and different granularity. Kenneth Ring, in his 1980 analysis, Life at Death, identified a 5-stage model. Michael Sabom and Bruce Grayson have worked with more granular models. But when the core phenomenology is laid out, the stages that the data reliably supports cluster into something remarkably close to 7. Separation, observation, transit, encounter with beings, encounter with boundary, light, life review, and return. 7 stages, in the same sequence. Across accounts from every culture, 7 gates in the Sumerian texts, 7 stages in modern NDE phenomenology. The number may be genuinely structural, may reflect something about the actual architecture of the process rather than being a symbolic choice. The Sumerian choice of 7 for the gates of the underworld appears in other major ancient traditions as well. 7 stages of descent to the underworld appear in various forms in ancient Mesopotamian, Egyptian, and Indo-European traditions. The recurrence of 7 is typically explained by mythologists as reflecting the importance of the 7 visible planets in ancient astronomy. And that explanation may be partially correct. But it does not account for why the 7-stage structure of the underworld journey should map onto the 7-stage structure of the modern clinical near-death experience, unless both are reflecting the same underlying reality. The Anunnaki Urugal, the 7 great judges, are described in the Sumerian texts with specific individual characteristics. They are not interchangeable. Each one has a specific quality, a specific area of knowledge, a specific role in the assessment of the newly dead. The Tablet of Destinies is not examined as a whole by a single judge. It is examined section by section, quality by quality, consequence by consequence, by judges who each specialize in a specific dimension of the being's life and existence. Modern NDE life review accounts describe the review in terms that are compatible with exactly this kind of multi-dimensional assessment. People do not describe the life review as a general scan. They describe it as total, as encompassing every dimension of their existence in a way that implies multiple perspectives or multiple modes of examination operating simultaneously. The relational dimension, the emotional dimension, the consequential dimension, the intentional dimension, as if different aspects of the life are being examined by different aspects of a larger intelligence, each seeing something that the others also see but from a different angle. 7 judges, 7 gates, 7 stages. And a review that is total because it is multidimensional, examining every aspect of a life from every relevant perspective simultaneously. The architecture is the same, the language is different. The evidence is 4,000 years of separation. The match is precise. And there is one more dimension of the 7 judges that deserves attention, because it appears in the Sumerian texts in a form that has an extraordinary modern correlate. The 7 Anunnaki judges are described, in certain texts, as not merely assessing the newly dead, but as being genuinely interested in what they find. As being, in some sense, curious about the experience of the individual consciousness that has arrived before them, as wanting to know not just what was done, but what was felt, not just what was accomplished, but what was understood. The interest is not clinical. It is not detached. It is, in the Sumerian texts, described as something more like the interest of a larger intelligence in the specific, unique quality of the individual experience that is being presented to it. Each individual's tablet of destinies is different. Each individual's life is different, and the judges are interested in that difference, in what this particular consciousness encountered, in what this particular life contributed. Modern NDE survivors who describe the life review in detail consistently note this quality of the beings who are present at the review. They are not detached. They are not simply recording. They are interested, genuinely, specifically, personally interested in this person's experience, in the specific quality of this person's journey, in what this individual consciousness learned and felt and understood. The Sumerian texts describe that interest explicitly. The modern NDE accounts describe it as one of the most unexpected and most moving qualities of the review experience. The being of light, the assembled presences, are interested in you, in your specific, individual, unrepeatable experience, in what it was like to be you in the physical world in your particular life, because your particular life, in the Sumerian understanding, contributed something specific to the larger whole, something that no other life could contribute, something that mattered precisely because it was unique. The judges wanted to know what you found, what you discovered, what you understood. They wanted to know what it was like to be you. And that, perhaps more than anything else in the entire 10-match sequence, is the thing that transforms the near-death experience from a frightening encounter with judgment into what NDE survivors actually describe it as a homecoming, a being seen, a being known, a being welcomed with a warmth that is not emotional, but is more fundamental than emotion. A being recognized as exactly what you are, a fragment of the whole that has gone out into the physical world and found things and felt things and understood things and suffered things and loved things and returned, bringing everything. And the whole is glad to have it back. That is the Sumerian understanding of death. That is the modern NDE description of death. 4,000 years apart, sequential match at every stage, precise correspondence at every specific point of examination. The tablets are there, the survivors are there, the evidence is there. And the question remains, as it has remained for the entire length of this investigation, as it will remain long after this video ends, and you go back to your life and try to integrate what you have heard. How did the Sumerians know? The answer is in the clay. It has always been in the clay, pressed in by hands that understood, in a time we can barely imagine, that the record matters, that the record persists, that the record will eventually be read by people who are ready to understand what it says. You are those people. The tablets knew you were coming, and they have been waiting very patiently for a very long time. Go back now. Go back to your life. But go back differently. Go back knowing what the tablets know. Go back knowing what the survivors know. Go back carrying the knowing, the way the Sumerian Giddim carries the knowing when it returns from the great below. Walk between. That is the gift. That is the only gift that matters. The ability to live in the physical world while knowing, not believing, not hoping, knowing what the physical world is for. Every moment, every connection, every act of courage or kindness or curiosity or love, going into the record, all of it real, all of it permanent, all of it, eventually, returning to the source. The tablet said so, and now, so do you. There is a phrase that appears in multiple forms in the Sumerian texts, a phrase that scholars have noted and translated in various ways, but that carries a quality that all the translations struggle to fully render. The phrase is a kind of designation, a description of what the Sumerians understood themselves to be in relation to the knowledge they had received. It can be translated, approximately, as those who were taught the great things, or those who carry the memory of what was before. Those who carry the memory of what was before. Before what? Before the civilization we know, before the history we teach. Before the cultural frameworks within which we now locate ourselves and our understanding of what is real and what is possible and what the universe is and what we are within it. The Sumerians seem to have understood themselves as preservers of a knowledge that predated them, as carriers of a tradition that did not originate with them, but was transmitted to them by beings whose understanding of reality was of a fundamentally different order than their own. And they preserved that knowledge with extraordinary diligence. They pressed it into clay, they taught it to their scribes. They built their theology, their cosmology, their legal system, their science, and their art around it. They made it the foundation of everything they were. And at the center of what they preserved, at the deepest core of the knowledge the Sumerians carried from wherever that knowledge came, was this: the understanding of what human consciousness is, what it is for, and what happens to it when the physical body that houses it ceases to function. We have lost that understanding. Not entirely the near-death survivors are recovering it, one clinical death at a time, one return at a time. But culturally, collectively, institutionally, we have lost it. We live in a civilization built on the assumption that consciousness ends at death, that the moments of our lives have no inherent significance beyond what we assign to them, that the physical world is all there is, and that its ending is total. The Sumerians would not recognize that assumption. They would find it not just philosophically incorrect, but practically dangerous. Because a civilization that believes consciousness ends at death is a civilization that has removed the most powerful incentive for ethical behavior, not the incentive of divine punishment, which the Sumerians also had, but the more fundamental incentive of permanent consequence. The knowledge that every action, every moment, every choice is permanently real and permanently part of a record that will eventually be read by a larger intelligence that is genuinely interested in what you found and what you did and what you understood. Remove that knowledge from a civilization and you get exactly what you have. You get a culture in which the long-term consequences of actions are constantly discounted in favor of immediate gain. A culture in which the suffering of others is tolerable because it is ultimately temporary and meaningless. A culture in which the small moments of daily kindness and daily cruelty are treated as trivial because nothing ultimately is significant. The near-death survivors who come back from the boundary are unanimous on this point. The life review changes everything. Not because the review involves punishment, not because there is condemnation or retribution, but because the complete, multidimensional, inescapable experience of your own effect on every being you have ever touched makes it impossible to maintain the fiction that your actions are ultimately trivial. Makes it impossible to pretend that the person you were cruel to on a random Tuesday was not real in a way that mattered. Makes it impossible to dismiss the small act of kindness as inconsequential when you can feel directly and completely what it meant to the person who received it. The Sumerians knew this. They built their entire civilization on the knowledge that the tablet records everything, that nothing is lost, that everything matters, that the web of consequence is total and real and visible from the perspective of the larger intelligence that holds the record. We have forgotten this. And the forgetting has consequences that are visible everywhere in the culture we have built. The tablets are the memory. The near-death survivors are the living embodiment of what happens when that memory is recovered directly through the experience itself, rather than through the cultural transmission that the Sumerians tried to maintain for us. The tablets and the survivors are saying the same thing. They have always been saying the same thing. Across 4,000 years of separation, in languages so different they share no alphabet, in contexts so different they share no historical horizon, the message is the same. You are real. Your life is real. Every moment is real. Every connection is real. The record is real. The review is real. The realm you will return to when the body stops is real. And knowing this, genuinely knowing it, not as a comforting belief, but as the best available evidence from the oldest written civilization and the most rigorous modern clinical research changes everything about how you live, the time you have been given. That is the gift of the tablets. That is the gift of the survivors. That is the gift that the Anunnaki, if the Sumerian texts are to be believed, designed the system to convey to every consciousness that passes through it. The knowing, the walking between, the changed life. You have heard the 10 matches now. You cannot unhear them. The record of your hearing them is already real and already permanent in ways you may not yet fully understand. What comes next is up to you, but the tablets have faith that you will choose well. They have always had faith in the consciousness they helped create. And that faith pressed into clay 4,000 years ago by hands that understood is perhaps the most extraordinary thing of all.